Without further ado, I would love to introduce to you my friend, Dennis Goldford, who is a professor of political science at Drake University. And just a little side note, Dennis was our very first presenter, if you'll remember, 4 years ago at Intersections, and he launched this whole program for us in 2012. And so we wanted to bring him back because it's certainly an important time to talk about religious freedom and religion and politics and the Caucuses. So Dennis Goldford is professor of political science at Drake University and the Flansburgh Fellow in the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement. He's been at Drake since 1985, teaching in the areas of political theory, constitutional law, and American politics. He received his BA in political science and philosophy from the University of Michigan, a Master of Letters in philosophy from Oxford University, and an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. Professor Goldford has written 3 books, and the last one is, the second one is the Iowa Caucuses, the Making of a Media Event, and his most recent book is titled The Constitution of Religious Freedom, God, Politics, and the First Amendment. And that was, as I said, published in 2012. And he's currently doing research dealing with the constitutional claims of the Tea Party movement. So I'm sure we'll be back after he has that published. Professor Goldford has served as a political analyst for a wide variety of local, regional, national, and international print and broadcast media organizations. And won't you welcome Professor Dennis Goldford.
Okay.
You can find your way up.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. That's like the folks you see trying to come up during the Academy Awards or something, but I'm not dressed as well. But thank you very much for having me back. I'm flattered by that. It's always easy to be asked to speak somewhere the first time. The trick is whether they ask you back. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. What was the old Chinese phrase? It's a curse to say we live in interesting times. But of course, we have the fascinating event going on in Loudoun County in Kentucky at the moment, which has to do precisely with the sorts of issues we're concerned about. And in a way, that's an issue that's as old as Western civilization. When I was a freshman in college, I had to take 2-semester course. It's one of those things I never would have chosen to take the courses, but in retrospect, I was glad somebody made me take them. It was a course in what was called Great Books. So it was Greek and Roman classics, basically. So of course we read the Iliad, the Odyssey, things like that, but one of the Greek playwrights we read was a fellow named Sophocles. And Sophocles, one of his plays or one of his books was called The Antigone. And that's precisely what we see going on in Kentucky. The claims of the individual, the claims of conscience, the claims of belief in God or the gods as they put it back then, versus the claims of the law, the claims of the state. And this is something that appears 2,500 years ago in the Antigone written by Sophocles. Well, Connie asked me to speak to you for about 20 to 25 minutes about the current political scene insofar as it has to do with the question of religious freedom. I always say that, well, I'll work with 20 to 25 minutes. It takes a professor 15 minutes just to clear his throat. So Al Fisher was here, so I apologize there. But I want to talk to you in the brief time allotted to me about 2 items, basically. The first is the issue of religious liberty as it has been discussed and publicized this election season so far, and then the politics of the issue of religious liberty. Okay? Let me recite some words for you, and they should be familiar to you. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, of course, you know those are from the Declaration of Independence. I've reached the point in my career at which my students believe I was there when they wrote this. But I assure them that I wasn't, and still receive a skeptical look. But there are lots of things we can talk about in this regard, but let me ask you to start off with a little audience participation, because it has to do with the idea of religious liberty. There's reference again that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. What is an unalienable right? We say nowadays inalienable. But what's an inalienable right? What does that mean?
Can't be taken away.
It can't be taken away, right? It can't be taken away. Okay, but there's a problem with that I want you to think about for a moment. Leave life and pursuit of happiness aside. It's simpler if we look at liberty, right? So if we say we have an inalienable right to liberty, it means it can't be taken away. Yet the government can put us in prison. But if the government can put us in prison, they've taken away our liberty. But as this gentleman suggested, the idea of an inalienable right is that it's a right that cannot be taken away. How do we square that circle? Welcome to my class. There will be an exam at 12:45. If an inalienable right, we have an inalienable right to liberty, according to the Declaration of Independence, and that would include our religious liberty, which is where I'm going. Okay? It means it's a right that cannot be taken away. But we say the government, providing it follows certain rules, okay, can lock us up, can put us in prison. So how do we deal with that? Does that mean that the right to liberty is not inalienable? That Jefferson and the committee that wrote the Declaration were wrong? Yes, sir. There was...
When the government puts somebody in prison.
Well, let me ask you to sort of head and swallow. So first, it's hard to understand.
I didn't hear what you said.
Go ahead and finish your what you're eating, and then we'll hear you better.
Puts you in prison.
Yes.
Most probably the person that's going to prison has violated somebody else's rights.
Okay. But that doesn't, you're exactly right, but that doesn't answer the question. Because you're saying the person deserved it. Okay? But that's not the question. The question is not whether you deserve to be deprived of your liberty, but if liberty is an inalienable right, how is it possible? Not whether you deserved it, but how is it possible? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think liberty is a right that comes to us because we are, because we exist. Clearly, it is a right that can be taken away because we take it away all the time. So it seems to me the important thing to remember is what we're doing when we deal with the liberty that we are messing around with.
Okay, but that still suggests in a sense that under certain circumstances people deserve to be deprived of their liberty.
Yes, it will be deprived.
Okay, will be. But then it's not inalienable because we started off saying an inalienable right is one that can't be taken away from you. Yes, sir.
In order to preserve the rights to liberty of everyone else in the society.
Again, that's not wrong, but it explains that that's why we do it. But the question is not why we do it, but how is it possible to do it? You know, either we've got to figure out what it means to say that we have an inalienable right to liberty, or else we're left saying they were wrong in the Declaration of Independence. Yes, ma'am.
Because they said the Creator endowed it, not the government.
Well, maybe, but the government can lock you up.
Right.
You've been deprived of your liberty, correct?
Because they didn't give it to you.
Okay.
They don't have to
But the point is,
acknowledge
but they
that.
still locked you up. They still took your liberty away from you.
Right.
Okay? Then how can that be an inalienable right?
Well, with every right, there's a responsibility,
Yes, with every right there's a responsibility.
and you have to follow laws or rules
Right?
that
Okay.
have been put down.
So again, you're speaking to the question of the justification for doing it. Okay? One more, and then I'll try to suggest a solution.
I think freedom of conscience, that they cannot take your conscience away from you, even if they lock up your body.
Okay, so you still have presumably a certain freedom of conscience, okay? But they've still locked you up, right? They've still locked you up. So you see there's a conundrum here. There's a problem.
I think it's understood that due process must be involved.
Okay, and that's a step toward the answer. Due process, right.
And putting due process, defining what due process is a good question, but I think it's understood in that reading that once due process is involved, you can be locked up.
Okay, so if it's been done under conditions of due process, then it's okay. But again, the question is, how is it, if you've got a right that cannot be taken away, even if you do it in accordance with due process, the right's being taken away, isn't it? That's the problem. Well, here's what I pose as the solution, okay? Government can take away our liberty. What government cannot do is take away our right to liberty. They can take away our liberty, but not our right to liberty. But what does that mean? Okay? Do you remember, at least when I was a kid growing up, at times on TV, you'd see these awful, awful old Roman Empire movies, and you'd have the gladiators fighting, right? And you've got the emperor sitting up there, and the gladiators are fighting down there in the Colosseum, and one guy gets the other one down on the ground, has got his foot on his chest, and is about to put his sword through his neck or something, and he looks up at the emperor, and the emperor just sort of lies up there and maybe sort of goes like this, or like this. I mean, okay? What kind of action is that? In other words, whether that person in the Colosseum lives or dies depends upon ultimately what?
The judge.
Well, the emperor, okay? But we say whether the emperor does this or this, how would we normally categorize that? It's arbitrary, exactly. It's arbitrary, okay? What it means to say that the government can take away a liberty, but not our right to that liberty, is to say that the government can take away our liberty, but it has to give us a good reason. It has to give us a good reason. The government can't do it, in the term of art, arbitrarily or capriciously. The government has to give us a good reason. So what's inalienable? Not your liberty. What's inalienable is your right that government give you and the public a good reason, hence due process, for doing it. Do you see the distinction? So our liberty is not inalienable. Government can lock us up. In certain states, our life is not inalienable, right? They can execute us. Okay? But what is inalienable is the fact that we are entitled to a good reason for the government taking the action it's doing. Okay? Well, how good of a reason does government have to give if it wants to infringe upon a fundamental right like religious liberty? Okay? Well, the Supreme Court has developed, I have to use a technical term, it's developed what it calls levels of scrutiny. Levels of scrutiny. And this has directly to do with the claims of religious liberty now. When a person wants to claim that the government is infringing upon his right to any liberty, but say religious liberty, there are three standards the government chooses from to address the question. The highest level of scrutiny is what's called strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny. What that means is if the government's going to deprive you of the liberty in question, it's got to demonstrate that doing so is necessary to achieve a compelling government purpose. So the two key terms are necessary and compelling. The government has got to demonstrate that it's necessary to achieve a compelling government purpose. If the government can demonstrate that, then the government can infringe upon your liberty. Okay? In other words, what we hear a lot from candidates with talks about religious liberty in the campaign today is the claim, in a sense, that there are no reasons that the government can possibly give you to infringe upon your religious liberty. But in our American constitutional tradition, that has never been the case. Right? That's never been the case. Right? But the highest bar the government has to clear if it wants to survive a constitutional challenge and infringe upon your religious liberty is that the government has to prove that doing so is necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. There's a lower level of scrutiny sometimes called intermediate scrutiny or intermediate level scrutiny, okay? And what the government must do there is demonstrate that infringing upon the liberty in question is substantially related to an important government purpose. See, so instead of necessary to achieve a compelling government purpose, it's substantially related. You see how that's a looser standard. And instead of a compelling government purpose, now it's important government purpose. This is a level of scrutiny that the whole court sort of never officially adopted, but they've used it with regard to sex discrimination cases. I should say with regard to strict scrutiny, what triggers strict scrutiny? What makes the court say, oh, we've got to look at this under the rubric of strict scrutiny? There are two criteria. One, is it a fundamental right? Is it a fundamental right? Okay? And religious liberty is included among those. It's a fundamental right. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and so forth. That triggers strict scrutiny. The other criterion for that triggers strict scrutiny is the concept of whether a suspect classification is involved. Whether a suspect classification. Given the unfortunate aspects of American history, the classic suspect classification is race. Right? So if the government makes distinctions among people on the basis of race, that's a suspect classification because of our history, automatically triggers strict scrutiny. So the highest bar the government has to clear is strict scrutiny. The next level, a lower bar, is intermediate level scrutiny. And then the lowest bar, that government almost always wins these, is called the rational basis test. The rational basis test. And that says the government law or policy at issue is reasonably related to a legitimate governmental purpose. See, so we have necessary, then we had substantially related, and now we had reasonably related. You see how that's a much lower bar. And you have compelling governmental purpose, important governmental purpose, or legitimate governmental purpose. So these are these levels of scrutiny. What this means, it's a fancy way of saying that these are the kinds of reasons government can give, or these are the tests government has to meet when it's going to give us a reason for depriving us of, say, the free exercise of religion. Okay? So again, lots of folks now, for example, Ms. Davis in Kentucky is claiming that there's an absolute bar. Government never has a reason good enough or strong enough to deprive her of what she considers her religious liberty. Now, one of the things we have to remember, and I may have talked about this on my visit a few years ago, is that for all the aspects of our religious freedom, it is not a violation of my religious freedom for someone to tell me that I do not have the freedom to impose my religious values on you. Okay? You're not violating my religious freedom if you're telling me I cannot impose my religious values on you. See, the same thing works in reverse for you. It's no violation of your religious freedom if the government prevents you from imposing your religious values on me. Okay? But you see, Ms. Davis is making a very absolutist claim. There are no legitimate reasons the government can give for infringing, in her view, upon her religious liberty. Now, prior to 1990, any government infringement upon our freedom of religion triggered the strict scrutiny test, requiring, again, the government to demonstrate that this infringement was necessary to achieve a compelling governmental purpose. What happened in 1990? That was the year the Supreme Court decided the case of Employment Division, Department of Human Resources of Oregon versus Smith. Has anybody ever heard of that case? The Employment Division versus Smith. This was the famous peyote case. Okay, there were two Native Americans who were terminated. They, oddly enough, I think, worked for the unemployment division there, HR. But they were terminated because they had smoked peyote, and Oregon had a substance abuse, substance control law that banned the use of peyote like that. And they made the claim, and they were denied unemployment benefits because that's why they were terminated. And they appealed in standard free exercise terms of requesting an exemption from Oregon's law because they said, look, we're Native Americans. This is part of a religious ritual, just as wine may be part of a religious ritual to take communion or some other standard religious practice like that. Okay? So this was the peyote case. The court rejected their claim. Okay? And this is what Justice Scalia wrote. He said, respondents in the present case contend that their religious motivation for using peyote places them beyond the reach of a criminal law that is not specifically directed at their religious practice, and that is concededly constitutional as applied to those who use the drug for other reasons. In other words, the two guys said, look, yeah, if somebody just wants to smoke peyote to get high, that's not a legitimate reason for exempting them from the law. But we're not smoking it just to get high. It is part of a religious ritual. So Justice Scalia said, they assert, in other words, that prohibiting the free exercise of religion includes requiring any individual to observe a generally applicable law that requires or forbids the performance of an act that his religious belief forbids or requires. As a textual matter, we do not think the words must be given that meaning. Now, what Scalia and the majority in the court were concerned about was everybody thinking that everybody thinks he can say, oh, I have a religious veto on this law. I'm sorry, officer, God told me get to Cedar Rapids in time for a 12 o'clock talk. And the fact that I was doing 90 on Interstate 80, I can be excused from being punished for that because I'm acting in accordance with God's plan.
Yes, Governor.
All right? Pardon?
Yes, Governor.
See, that's the problem that Scalia and the rest of the court were concerned about. Everybody's going to claim, I'm sorry, I can't do that. God tells me I can't. Look at Kentucky, right? Or, I'm sorry, civil authorities, but according to my religion, if I'm going to get to heaven, I have to engage in human sacrifice every Friday. Okay? See, the problem is you can't have a functioning legal system if everybody can say, well, okay, I'm going to obey all these laws except when I say God tells me not to. Right? So that's the problem. So Scalia continued. He says, conscientious scruples have not, in the course of the long struggle for religious toleration, relieved the individual from obedience to a general law not aimed at the promotion or restriction of religious beliefs. The mere possession of religious convictions, which contradict the relevant concerns of a political society, does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibilities. Okay? So he quotes the famous case of Reynolds versus the United States from 1879. That was the polygamy case, right? Whether a federal law banning polygamy violated Mormon interest. Okay? And he said, in that court, the justices asked, can a man excuse his practices to the contrary of the law because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect to permit any citizen to become a law unto himself. I'll decide ultimately which laws I obey and which I don't, based upon my conscience or what I think God tells me. You can't have a functioning society or legal system under that circumstance. So the principal claim of the Smith decision was, to quote, the right of free exercise does not relieve an individual of the obligation to comply with a valid and neutral law of general applicability on the ground that the law proscribes conduct that his religion prescribes. Okay? Well, what this seemed to do, and people on the religious right for the religious left, it wasn't just conservative evangelicals, it was social active Protestants and Jews and Catholics and others, it was across the religious spectrum. They became very alarmed at this decision because they thought what this decision did, remember levels of scrutiny. Prior to this, it was that strict scrutiny. The government must demonstrate that the law in question is necessary to achieve a compelling state interest. Well, the outcome of the Smith decision seemed to suggest that they had lowered the bar. That all government had to do was show that the law was reasonably related to a legitimate governmental purpose. So that made people across the religious spectrum, from liberal to conservative, from left to right, very nervous. That's what led to, if you've heard the phrase RFRA, right? The Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993, which expressly restored the strict scrutiny rule. That act said, government shall not substantially burden a person's free exercise of religion unless it is in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest and is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest. Okay? And lots of states since then have started passing their own state-level religious freedom restoration acts. What's different about the recent run of these, though, is that states have become, just as in the Hobby Lobby decision, they've begun giving religious status or religious exemption rights, not just to individual people, but to corporations. Okay? Now, what we're hearing in the present day, particularly in the past year or two, especially as the presidential campaign has gotten underway, again, it's a claim that goes beyond strict scrutiny. Right? Again, with strict scrutiny, it's a high bar. And most of the time, if the issue in question triggers strict scrutiny, the government loses. But it's still possible to say, well, government has to demonstrate that the law is necessary to achieve a compelling governmental purpose. It's possible for a court to say the government has done that. Right? But the kinds of claims we're hearing now from people who talk about religious liberty is the claim that there's an absolute protection of religious liberty, of the sort we see in Kentucky right now. Okay, remember she said, quote, to issue a marriage license which conflicts with God's definition of marriage with my name affixed to the certificate would violate my conscience. Again, she's claiming what the Smith decision wanted to avoid, that a single individual can say, I'm sorry, I can't obey that law. Or, I'm going to take your car because God tells me there really isn't anything such as private property. We should all share things in common. You know, there's no end to those possibilities. Now, a lot of this is crass electoral politics and pandering. All right? Remember, as we think of here in Iowa, in 2008 and 2012, conservative evangelicals are about a quarter of the population of Iowa. But there are close to 60% of Republican caucus goers in 2008 and 2012, right? So quite, it's a democratic process, small d, everything's legitimate, but they punch way above their weight, right? And so you see people like, Ted Cruz really focusing on the support of conservative evangelicals, Bobby Jindal, Mike Huckabee. Now, a lot of this is demagogic, right? I mean, Cruz said about Kentucky that they're putting this woman in prison because of her religious beliefs. No, right? They're putting her in prison because she's disobeying her job description and violating the order of the court to act in accordance with her job description. Right? One of the key elements in our religion clause jurisprudence is that belief is absolute. Government simply cannot pass a law. If it tried to do so, it would be struck down immediately, saying that you must believe in X or you are forbidden to believe in X. Belief is absolute, the courts have always said. But they've said Congress is subject, Congress should be, but conduct is subject to regulation. Belief is not subject to regulation, but conduct is subject to regulation. But again, how good of a reason does government have to give to regulate the conduct? We're back to this idea of levels of scrutiny. Okay? But again, the kinds of claims that you hear when Mike Huckabee says that there's a war on Christianity, there's an attempt to criminalize Christianity, this is rank demagoguery. Okay? It's all heat and it's no light. Right? But as we look at this, and I've been to several events, and again, I've been to Democratic events, but there have been relatively fewer. I've been, with the whole cast of characters, there are a lot many more Republican events. So I went to the Steve King Summit, and I went to the Faith and Freedom Coalition Summit in April, okay? And so there's a lot of talk about these issues because it's a very concerned constituency. So there's something broader going on here, and this leads to the politics of the religious freedom issue. The presidential candidates, or any candidate, who appeals to Christian, or often it's more broadly phrased as Judeo-Christian values, when they make that appeal, they're implicitly operating on the assumption that the United States is an essentially religious community, right? It's the idea that part of being an American is to belong to a religious community. Okay? Now, the other view is that, on this one view, the American political order is constituted as a religious community. You see that very much, in some more evangelical terms, that America is the new Israel. We have a special covenant with God. God looks upon us, and you had they got in big trouble for it. But after 9/11, remember Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell made the claim that the destruction of the Trade Center towers was because America permits homosexuality and abortion. Okay, but there's this idea that we are a religious community, in some sense responsible as a nation to God. It's an old, respectable belief. But see, the other view is that the American political order is one which encourages and allows people to have their own particular religious identity and mission, but it itself does not have one. It itself does not have one. And I'm going to watch my time here, so I could go into that further, but I'll wait for a question if you want me to there. But for example, Ted Cruz's Iowa campaign chairman, Matt Schultz, a couple of weeks ago suggested at a rally that Senator Cruz was divinely chosen to lead. Quote, "We're at a crossroads at our country," Schultz told the crowd. "Ted Cruz is the man who God has prepared for this moment in time to be our champion, to fight for our husbands, our wives, our children, and our grandchildren, for our country." Okay? So candidates make appeals like this to affirm what they consider to be the essentially religious nature of American citizenship and the essentially religious nature of the American political order. Okay? But one of the reasons this is emphasized now is that it reflects, particularly among the religiously conservative, mostly evangelical, some Catholic, some Orthodox Jews, but mostly conservative evangelicals. They have a much more pessimistic assessment of contemporary American life. There's a belief among some Christians, particularly conservative evangelical Christians, that Christianity is transitioning from a majority position in the United States to a minority position. Right? I mean, what goes around comes around. Conservatives for years complain that Democrats and liberals always talk about victimology. Oh, I've suffered from this and we're victims, and they've looked down at that. But now conservative Christians see themselves as the new victims. We're being persecuted. Okay? So there's a website called The Baptist Standard, for example. And the editor talks about what he calls the decline of, quote unquote, Protestant privilege. He says, as soon as Europeans landed on these shores, Protestants dominated the culture. Despite the religion clauses, he adds, since Protestants historically outnumbered everyone else, they shaped public enterprises, government, religion, education, business, and even sports to a lesser extent, entertainment. That's what appears to be changing. I mean, consider it's just simply serendipitous and it has no huge meaning, but for the first time in our history, there are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. You have 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. There are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. It's the first time that's ever been the case in American history. Another fellow by the name of Damon Linker, a longtime observer of Christian conservatism, writes, "The mood among social conservatives has been darkening for years as a liberal Democrat has taken and held the White House, as the Republican Party has placed greater emphasis on economic concerns than culture war issues, and most of all as same-sex marriage has come to be accepted by more than half of the country, and Democrats have begun to embrace it without apology. But," he continues, "nothing compares to the gloom that set in during the weeks since the passage of Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act sparked a rapid and widespread condemnation of religious traditionalists, not only by gay activists and liberal Democrats, but also by a number of Republicans with national stature and high-profile members of the business community. Suddenly," he concludes, "social conservatives began to think the unthinkable. Is it possible that we're now, conservative Christians, in the minority, with our freedoms subject to the whims of a hostile majority that will use the power of the modern liberal state, especially anti-discrimination laws, to enforce public conformity to secular anti-Christian norms?" So This is why we've begun, the new Christian conservative position, I think, that you hear among a lot of Republican candidates is this, essentially. If we cannot impose, as we've done in the past, if we cannot impose our values and rules on society at large, then we want to be able to opt out of the need to obey society's values and rules when we see them conflicting with our own values and rules. This is why we've come to hear about what some Christian conservative intellectuals call the Benedict option. The idea of traditionalist Christians choosing to step back from the now futile political projects and ambitions of the past 4 decades to cultivate and preserve a robustly Christian subculture within an increasingly hostile common culture. So the idea is that, okay, if we can't run society anymore, as we used to, the sort of Protestant privilege, we want to withdraw into our own communities where essentially the laws of the broader polity, which they see as hostile to Christianity, don't apply to us. Okay? And again, these presidential candidates use these real hopes and concerns and fears for their own political reasons, oftentimes, unfortunately, in tremendously demagogic fashion. But that's why there's this focus on religious liberty. I mean, rhetorically, who's against liberty? Right? But they phrased it in terms of religious liberty, and we're back in a way to the 1992 Republican National Convention where Patrick Buchanan said, quote, "There is a religious war going on in this country." Okay? Christian conservatives, particularly again conservative evangelical Christians, believe this to be the case, and they believe that the same-sex marriage decision is evidence that they are losing or have lost that war. Republican candidates like Ted Cruz, Mike Huckabee, Bobby Jindal, Rick Santorum to some extent, among others, are appealing to this intensely motivated because intensely fearful constituency to support their bid for the party's nomination and eventual capture of the White House. I'll conclude and then take some questions, but I remember in 1996, remember Bob Dole picked Jack Kemp to run as his vice presidential nominee against President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. And Kemp was at a Republican rally, an event of some sort, and one of the speakers with him said, "We've got to defeat our enemies, the Democrats." And Kemp said something really classy. He said, "No, you're wrong." He said, "The Democrats aren't our enemies. They're our opponents. We're all Americans." What I find tremendously discouraging is that I'm coming to believe that we don't live in that country anymore. So let me take questions. Yes, ma'am.
Let me bring the microphone to you.
Or I can just use it.
Yeah. You work the back half and I'll work the front half.
I'm just interested if there is a time, a market time that you can cite when those running for the presidency invoked their religion as part of their platform and even maybe did the kind of pandering that you're talking about. And what were the forces that drove them to do that?
Right. To some extent, it came, I mean, the 19th century, remember there's a group, for example, called Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Do you know what the original name of that group was? Protestant Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They were tremendously fearful of increasing Catholic influence. Right? So there was an anti-Catholicism involved in some of that. But in the 20th century itself, I think it came with Jimmy Carter's run for the presidency, which of course put the Iowa caucuses on the map. Because he was the first person to run explicitly and tell people he was a born-again Christian. Most people out of the South or small towns in the Midwest didn't have a clue what that meant. Right? So remember when he sort of oddly did an interview for Playboy magazine, not that I would ever read such a thing, right? Or for the articles only, right? But he used a phrase that, you know, I think they asked him if he had ever committed adultery, and he said he had lust in his heart, right? And he was ridiculed by a lot of people, but within the evangelical community, that had very clear, distinct meaning, okay? So Carter sort of, remember from the 20s on, evangelicals, especially after the Scopes trial and the ridicule, even though technically they won, they withdrew from politics. Okay? But with Carter, and for some other reasons I won't go into, they started to make more of a political appearance, but they were disappointed in Carter. And then Ronald Reagan in 1980 appeared before, I think it was the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said to them, I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. So that was very explicitly moving that in there, right? And so you had an engaged constituency, and then when it really took off was in 1988 here, when completely out from under the radar, who shows up in second place in the Republican caucuses but Pat Robertson? So that's when this really took off, okay, at that point. Yes?
Yes, sir. You mentioned the argument that Mr. Huckabee has made about there being an absolute religious right. I read recently that he's also making another argument, and that is that the Supreme Court cannot make a law. That is only a legislative function, and I wonder if you could comment on that in terms of our governance and our sense of jurisprudence and the role of the legislature.
How much time do you have? Yeah, under our system, technically, the legislature makes the law, the executive enforces or executes the law, and the judicial branches interpret the law, okay? And so, yes, I mean, anytime anybody doesn't like a decision the Supreme Court makes, the immediate response, whether you're liberal or conservative, is to say, oh, you guys are just making it up. You're not interpreting the law. You're making up your own law, right? So a lot of that's political rhetoric. But again, Huckabee is making the claim that American law must be understood as underneath and subject to and limited by, pick your phrase, the natural law or God's law or things like that. But that again gets back to the question, if we all knew and understood what God's law was, we wouldn't need human laws. Right? But we don't know what it is. We disagree about what it is. So we've got to find a way to live together despite our particular religious disagreements, among others. And we create human laws not for the sake of deciding, and courts will always say, we're not in the theology business. Our job is not to say what's true or false about God or things like that. Our job is to make sure that, as I put it in my book on law and religion, the Constitution does not protect religion. It protects religious freedom, which is very different. So you can believe what you want to believe, and you have every absolute right to do that. You just can't, if you try to persuade me to agree with you and I disagree and I won't agree with you, you can't invoke the power of the government to force me to believe you. Okay? So Mr. Huckabee, again, is challenging what the Supreme Court has said. But the Supreme Court's been challenged for 200 years, ever since it began. So, again, it's a huge topic in that regard. And let me just leave it there because, as I said, it's too big to deal with. Yes?
For those of us who regard the Iowa caucuses as a travesty of democracy and a remarkably foolish way to begin the process of choosing a president. Is there any prospect, do you think, that another state that is more representative of the American people and less dominated by religious conservatives, at least on the Republican side, will be given a turn, will be able to take a turn in the near future?
Again, how to boil this down. Nobody, two things. Number one, first of all, remember our political parties are not essentially national top-down organizations. I mean, the Democratic National Committee in Washington, the Republican National Committee, they're essentially trade associations of all the state parties. That's why they can suggest and plead with state parties to hold their primaries and caucuses on certain dates in a certain order, and the states will say, well, no, we're not going to do that, right? So given that, we have a sequential nomination system. One state goes, and then another state, and so forth. Now, second, it's not that anybody said in either party, well, we're going to design a system for nominating our presidents, and there's certain key criteria that the first state needs to fulfill to be the first state. Oh, it's Iowa, so we're going to go with Iowa. That's not what happened. It was all Jimmy Carter's fault, so to speak. It was all simple accident, right? He showed up, he lived here for 15 months, nobody had a clue who he was, but he'd stay with supporters, and lo and behold, he won the caucuses and went to the White House. Now, that could have been a one-off. That some crazy thing happened, never happened again. But in 1980, Ted Kennedy decided to mount his challenge to Jimmy Carter as a sitting president, came out here and fought and lost in the caucuses. And George Bush decided to challenge Governor Reagan, who had just barely missed the nomination in 1976. He decided to challenge Governor Reagan in the caucuses. So I think the fact that leading candidates in both parties thought Iowa was important is what institutionalized the caucuses. Now the caucuses, and I share some of your views, I mean, in a nutshell, I would say the caucuses are an essentially meaningless event with immense political impact. Okay? But the problem is states all around the country dislike Iowa's going first. But until they can agree on what should replace this order or system, by default it remains first. Okay? Iowa is not first because it's important. It's important because it's first. If you started it in New Mexico, it would be important because it's first. Okay? So until all the other states can agree on some solution, Florida will say, no, we should go first. Montana will say, no, we should go first. Both people living in North Dakota would say, we should go first. Okay? So, you know, that's where we are. Another question?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sir.
I have my impression is that almost all candidates for national offices have a close relationship with a religion. And the question I have, are there any, is this an accurate perception? And also, are there any inroads for the non-religious or the unreligious into politics?
Right. First of all, again, Republicans make more of an issue of religion than Democrats do. Okay? Republicans essentially, in 1992, I was writing a book on the sort of question the gentleman asked there about the role of the Supreme Court in the Constitution. So it wasn't directly related to this. But during the campaign in 1992, I looked at the 1992 Republican platform, George H.W. Bush, and the Democratic platform, Bill Clinton. I didn't bother with Ross Perot. I thought he was sort of a historical speed bump. And then I went back and I looked at the 1968 platforms of Hubert Humphrey for the Democrats, Richard Nixon for the Republicans, and George Wallace, right? American Independent Party, basically the anti-integration Alabama governor. And leaving aside at that time foreign affairs, you know, we had an interlude from roughly 1989 to 2001. Soviet Union was gone, there was no major competitor. So in 92, foreign affairs weren't a big issue, whereas in 68, Vietnam was in everything. Right? But leaving those things aside and looking at social and domestic policy, I thought the 1992 Democratic platform, in terms of the positions it took, looked like the 1968 Republican platform. Richard Nixon, Watergate aside, could never get a Republican nomination nowadays because they think he's too liberal. Right? And the 1992 Republican platform looked like the 1968 Wallace platform. In other words, the party of Abraham Lincoln is much more now the party of Jefferson Davis than the party of Abraham Lincoln. And there's an essential religiosity with Southern culture. So the Republicans have taken that, but now, at the same time, remember, people want as president someone they consider to be moral and ethical, a morally serious person, and religion is often taken as a marker for that. Now, you can ask about the prosperity gospel, what's called, you know what I'm familiar with? Yeah, you know, sow your seed, send me $1,000, you'll reap that 100-fold, and Creflo Dollar says, I need a $39 million jet, so, and so forth. You know, so the televangelists who seem to be pretty exploitative, send in your money and I will pray over this cloth and send it back to you, that sort of thing. That sort of thing aside, generally speaking, religion is seen as a marker for a kind of moral grounding. So there's always been, religion has been important in a way in American culture that has not been important in Western European societies in modern terms. An atheist, in terms of public opinion polls, who says avowedly, I am an atheist, has maybe only marginally somewhat more of a chance of being elected president, let alone being nominated, as somebody who says, I'm a Muslim extremist. Yes, sir.
I have been concerned about the influence of the Tea Party and the money that goes into the Tea Party coming from so many of the reactionary groups on civil rights that have come out through the years. Can you reflect on that in terms of our senators or new representatives being Tea Party people? What's that say for our state?
Yeah. Well, remember, there's a division. Connie and Kristen and I, we talked about it on the way over this morning. People talk about, say, the Koch brothers, right, with their tremendous amount of money. And they've given support to Tea Party groups, but they really have different agendas because Tea Party people are sort of, they're more populist than they are libertarian. In other words, Tea Party people are not against Social Security and Medicare, right? There was the infamous incident of somebody in the early stage of the Tea Party holding up a sign saying, keep the government's hands off my Medicare. Where do you think it comes from, right? But you see, the Tea Party folks are populist in the sense that they think they are the little guy getting squeezed and oppressed by the people with power and money. And, but they think it's the people, the undeserving, the lazy, the shiftless, that the people with power and money are acting on behalf of. So the Tea Party people say, we earned and deserve our Social Security and Medicare, but those people there don't and didn't. All right? That's different from, say, the Koch brothers and some of Rand Paul, who are more libertarian. They don't think there should be Social Security or Medicare at all, period. It's not that they think this group deserves it, this doesn't. They don't think it should exist at all. But they have a certain confluence of interest in that they don't like the modern welfare state, the social safety net. And yeah, there's a huge amount of money sloshing around out there. And that's what we're waiting to see, how that affects. It affected 2012 somewhat, but right now, Rick Perry's campaign is essentially roadkill. He's got one-page staffer here in Iowa, which is amazing because he has tremendous political skills. I mean, I've seen him in person. He really could talk to a couple of people or a table or this group with tremendous effectiveness. But his campaign's just going nowhere. He's out of money, but he's got a super PAC with $17 million. And they, at least for the time being, unless some of them pull their money out, they are willing, they can't coordinate. Now, how that precisely works is another issue. But they can't coordinate, but they become the de facto Rick Perry campaign, even though Perry can't talk to them or direct it. So the question is how all this big money will affect the campaign. It used to be, as poll numbers sank, your donors said, I'm not throwing good money after bad, goodbye. But if you've got a sugar daddy, think of Newt Gingrich and Sheldon Adelson in 2012. He kept Gingrich's campaign alive long after its sell-by date. All right? Gingrich was not going to get the nomination, but he kept him on the stage for all those debates because he had all that money. Well, these PACs may do this for Perry. We'll see what super PACs do for some other candidates. So again, money is increasingly a huge issue in campaigns. Some people think it's entirely legitimate. Other people think it's not, depending upon your point of view. Yes, ma'am.
What do you see as the future of any effort to overturn or legislate against Citizens United?
The Supreme Court does occasionally overrule a previous case. They don't like to, because again, that would undermine their authority. If they came up with a decision, if they were known for overturning their cases frequently, if you get a decision you don't like, you might as well say, well, just ignore it, give it a little while, and they'll overturn it, so we don't have to listen to them. So they're not going to do that. It could require a constitutional amendment, but either of those options, which I think are, at this point, the only way of dealing with it, are extremely difficult and unlikely. Right? There's a premise for the way the American political system operates, and it's this. It is possible to have meaningful legal and political equality in the context of substantial social and economic inequality. But that's the premise of our whole political order. It is possible to have legal and political equality in the context of substantial social and economic inequality. So I have one vote, and Charles Koch has one vote. So we're equally influential, right? I mean, that's the issue that comes up. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for your interest. Thank you for inviting me back.
Help me thank Dennis, please.